The heat outside Da Nang clung like a wet shroud. The monsoon clouds pressed low over the base, smearing the horizon into a dull, metallic blur. Captain Michael Torrance, U.S. Army Ordnance Corps, washed a flatbed truck back into the hangar bay, its tires splattering red mud across the concrete. What it carried did not belong in that place. Not in an American installation, not under fluorescent light, not in 1972. The object was a Soviet T-54 main battle tank, its turret scarred, its green paint dulled by years of tropical service. The Vietnamese stars had been hastily painted over with tar, but the outlines still bled through. The steel beast seemed almost alive, patient, wounded, waiting. The file on Torrance's desk called its subject Iron Lotus. Its capture, according to intelligence, had been opportunistic. A U.S. Marine reconnaissance platoon stumbled upon it abandoned near the Laotian border after an ambush. The crew had vanished. The engine was intact. Its ammunition stores remained full. Torrance's orders were simple and chillingly vague. Evaluate mechanical integrity, operational design, and combat survivability. Compare with M48A3 Patton parameters. He knew what that meant. They wanted to know how Soviet steel endured jungle war. He approached the tank slowly, circling it as mechanics pried open access panels. The armor bore the unmistakable fingerprints of Soviet design philosophy: rough welds, unrefined contours, functional brutality. It lacked the polish of American engineering, yet exuded a sense of grim certainty. Every bolt, every hinge, had purpose. A corporal from the maintenance crew wiped sweat from his brow. "Sir, it's ugly as sin. The welds look like someone used a spoon instead of a torch." Torrance crouched beside the tank's track, tracing his gloved hand along the links. "Ugly doesn't die easily," he murmured. The corporal grinned uncertainly. "You think it's still operational?" "I think it was never meant to stop." The first time Torrance climbed into the turret, he felt as though he were entering a bunker rather than a vehicle. The air smelled of grease, cordite, and damp cloth. The controls were crude but direct, levers of cold metal, pedals that resisted with heavy springs, dials labeled in Cyrillic. There were no electronics, no automation, no comfort. Only the blunt conversation between man and machine. He sat in the gunner's seat, peering through the optics. The glass was scratched but serviceable. The targeting system was laughably primitive compared to the ballistic computers on an American tank, yet something about its simplicity unsettled him. It was idiot-proof. In a war where mud could swallow machines and humidity could rot circuits, idiot-proof might be a kind of genius. The Soviet manuals that intelligence provided were terse, almost brutal in their clarity. No theoretical lectures, no engineering jargon, just imperatives. Load, fire, move, repeat. Torrance realized the design's secret then. It was not built for excellence. It was built for continuity, for soldiers with little training, for terrain that punished precision. That evening, he met with Colonel Harris, the operations chief overseeing the analysis project. The colonel's tone was dismissive. "So, Captain, what's your impression so far? Can we learn anything from this pile of bolts?" Torrance hesitated. "Sir, we can learn how to survive failure." Harris raised an eyebrow. "Speak plainly, Captain. This tank was built for imperfection. Everything about it assumes that things will go wrong, that crews will be untrained, supplies inconsistent, maintenance non-existent. Yet it keeps functioning. The Soviets designed it to endure neglect. We design ours to demand attention." The colonel's expression hardened. "We design ours to win." "Yes, sir," Torrance replied, "but only when everything goes right." Later, in the quiet of the maintenance bay, Torrance stood beside the T-54 under a single hanging bulb. Rain drummed against the tin roof. The tank's surfaces gleamed faintly, like the shell of some buried prehistoric creature resurrected from the mud. He found the logbook wedged behind the driver's seat, handwritten, water-damaged, its pages covered in Cyrillic script and greasy fingerprints. He could not read the words, but the stains and folds told their own story. Months of use, constant repair, a rhythm of adaptation. Somewhere between the smudged notes and burned corners, he could almost hear the ghosts of its former crew. The next morning, the test began. A team of engineers filled the fuel tank with local diesel, replaced 2 cracked hoses, and declared it ready. Torrance climbed in with a translator and a mechanic. When he turned the ignition, The engine coughed, stuttered, then roared with astonishing vigor. The vibration rattled the floor beneath his boots. He felt it more than heard it, the heartbeat of iron. They drove it slowly around the perimeter track. The controls were coarse, the clutch heavy, but the vehicle moved with implacable resolve. Through the narrow periscope slit, the world appeared as strips of jungle and sky sliding past like film reels. After 10 minutes, Torrance understood what the manuals could never convey. The T-54 was not a weapon. It was an idea, the embodiment of a doctrine that equated simplicity with immortality. At full throttle, the tank lumbered across the mud field, throwing clods of earth into the air. Its suspension groaned but held. When they tested the main gun with an inert shell, the recoil reverberated through Torrance's chest like thunder. He imagined North Vietnamese crews fighting from ambushes, firing once, disappearing into the foliage, surviving where American armor would have bogged and suffocated. That night, Torrance recorded his observations in his field journal. The T-54 is brutally efficient. It sacrifices comfort, speed, and precision for one thing: persistence. It assumes the world will collapse around it and still be required to move. Our M48s are technological monuments. Theirs are mechanical organisms. Ours need a system to survive. Theirs are the system. He stopped writing, listening to the storm rolling in from the east. In the distance, artillery echoed like restless memories. When he finally closed the notebook, he knew the conclusion he would eventually have to write, one his superiors would not want to read. To be continued. 3 days later, the tank was moved to a testing range outside Da Nang, a cratered expanse of red soil ringed by jungle. The morning air shimmered with humidity. Engineers in grease-stained uniforms clambered over the T-54, checking pressure gauges, clearing the barrel, tightening bolts. Torrance stood beside them, clipboard under his arm, watching the mist peel off the tree lean like smoke. They'd brought an M48A3 Patton for comparison, America's pride, its lines elegant, its interior humming with hydraulic systems and rangefinders. The two tanks sat side by side, products of opposing civilizations. The M48 looked like a machine that believed in order. The T-54 looked like one that expected chaos. "Captain," a young ordnance specialist called out, "we'll start with mobility trials." Torrance nodded. "Let's see what survival looks like at 40 tons. When the engine started, the contrast was immediate. The Patton's roar was smooth, almost cultured, a mechanical symphony of synchronized parts. The T-54's was a cough that became a growl, raw, uneven, but insistent. It sounded alive in a way the American tank never did. They raced the two machines down the length of the muddy range. Within minutes, the M48's treads clogged with clay. Its weight pressed it deep into the soaked earth. The T-54, lighter and simpler, plowed ahead, skimming over ruts that swallowed the American tank whole. The Soviet suspension groaned like an old ship, but it didn't stop. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to keep moving. When the test ended, Torrance climbed onto the turret, staring down at the mud-splattered hull. The paint steamed in the tropical heat, releasing that unmistakable smell: rust, oil, sweat, endurance. Colonel Harris arrived in a jeep, his boots already coated in red muck. "You look like you've fallen in love, Captain," he called. "Respect, sir," Torrance replied. "Not love. Respect for something that refuses to die." Harris glanced at the M48 being hauled out of its hole by a recovery vehicle. "So, what's your report going to say? That the Russians make better tanks?" "No, sir. That they make tanks for worse wars." That night, Torrance couldn't sleep. The barracks fan clicked above him like a metronome marking time he no longer believed in. He thought about the Soviet doctrine, decentralized, redundant, forgiving of error. He thought about how many of those tanks had crossed jungles, rivers, mountains, guided by farmers turned soldiers. And how many of his tanks would survive without fuel convoys, without spare parts, without engineers. He rose, walked out into the humid darkness, and sat on the T-54's hull. The metal was still warm. Fireflies floated like tracer rounds above the grass. He spoke quietly into his tape recorder. "Our machines demand civilization. There's endure without it. That's not inferiority. That's insurance." The next day brought weapons testing. The range officers had set up decommissioned bunkers for live fire. Torrance watched from a reinforced trench as the tank crew loaded a 100mm shell. "Target 1, 600 meters," the range officer shouted. The gunner squeezed the trigger. A deep concussion rolled across the field. The shell struck slightly high but tore through concrete like wet paper. The reload was manual, brutal, 2 men wrestling a steel cartridge into the breech. Yet within 20 seconds, the next shot landed closer to the mark. Torrance timed the intervals, scribbled notes, and realized something unnerving. There were no fragile systems to fail. No laser rangefinder to misalign. No stabilization gyros to jam. Just men, muscle, and metal. Later, when they opened the breech after 20 rounds, it was scorched black. The loader's gloves smoked. And still the mechanism worked. At lunch, Harris joined him again, chewing a cigar more than smoking it. "So what's the verdict?" "Still think simplicity's a virtue." Torrance looked up from his notes. "Simplicity is survival, sir. We've mistaken sophistication for security." Harris snorted. "You're starting to sound like you admire them." "I admire endurance," Torrance said quietly. "I'm just not sure we still know what it looks like." The colonel left without answering. A week later, word came down from Saigon. Command wanted a formal debrief. Torrance flew south in a C-123 transport, the engines droning like distant thunder. He brought with him his notes, photographs, and one small item, a chipped metal plaque pried from the T-54's hull, still marked with Cyrillic letters. The meeting was held in a windowless room at Tan Son Nhut Air Base. Around the table sat officers from intelligence, logistics, and research and development. The air smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke. Torrance began his briefing methodically: weight ratios, engine output, armor thickness. But soon his words turned from data to doctrine. "Gentlemen," he said, clicking through slides of the battered tank, "this vehicle isn't a symbol of backwardness. It's the physical manifestation of an idea that imperfection can be weaponized. It assumes chaos and still functions. That's not failure. That's design." A major from the engineering division scoffed. "Captain, the T-54 is obsolete. We've moved beyond this kind of crude manufacture." "Maybe," Torrance said, "but have we moved beyond the need to survive?" There was silence. Someone shifted papers. The colonel from Washington, Harris's superior, leaned forward. "You're suggesting we rethink our doctrine because of a rusty tank." "I'm suggesting that a system which collapses under stress isn't superiority," Torrance replied. "It's fragility disguised as progress." When the meeting ended, Few shook his hand. He knew how the report would be filed, buried under lessons learned and forgotten. But as he stepped out into the blinding heat, he felt strangely at peace. Back at Da Nang, the T-54 remained under its tarp, waiting like a sleeping relic. The war outside rolled on. Convoys burning, villages shifting hands, the jungle reclaiming everything. Torrance visited the tank one last time before his transfer. He laid his palm against its side. The steel was cool now. The rain had washed it clean. He whispered, "You'll outlast all of us, won't you?" The echo of distant thunder answered. He didn't write that line in his final report. Some truths weren't meant for official paper. By the time the war began to grind toward its inevitable end, Torrance had been reassigned to Logistics Command in Saigon, a posting that felt more like exile than promotion. His report on the captured T-54 had circulated, been annotated by anonymous reviewers, and ultimately stamped, "No further action." The message was clear. America had no time for philosophy in a war it still refused to call unwinnable. But the war itself was philosophy, written in fire, mud, and broken machines. Torrance spent his final months in Vietnam coordinating transport convoys and salvage operations. The jungles were swallowing everything. Convoys vanished on roads that had ceased to exist, airstrips crumbled under monsoon rain, and tanks that once symbolized dominance now sat rusting in the tall grass. He watched M48 Pattons stripped for parts and left to rot beside the same dirt roads where the T-54 had first been captured. One evening, during a rainstorm that drowned out the city's distant shellfire, a lieutenant brought him a message from Da Nang. The captured tank, subject Iron Lotus, was being shipped to the United States for technical evaluation. Torrance signed the authorization without hesitation but felt a strange pang, as though a piece of the jungle's unspoken truth was being uprooted and sent across the ocean to be misunderstood. He left Vietnam in April 1973. The flight home was quiet. The men aboard stared into their reflections on the cabin windows, as if hoping to see a reason for what they had survived. In the years that followed, Torrance was assigned to Aberdeen Proving Ground, where the U.S. Army dissected its trophies. There, in a fenced testing yard between new prototypes and the carcasses of old ones, he found it again, the same T-54 from Da Nang. The paint was faded, the turret scarred from ballistic trials, but the serial plate still read Gorky in 1965. He walked around it in the Maryland cold, his breath fogging the air. The tank looked smaller now, diminished outside its jungle context. Yet when he climbed into the driver's seat, the smell returned. Oil, metal, the faint ghost of tropical decay. It was as though the machine had carried the war inside it across the Pacific. On his desk that night, Torrance reopened his Vietnam notebook. The pages were warped and brown, edges crisped by humidity. He read his own words with the distance of another lifetime. There's endure without civilization. We build for control, not survival. Endurance is a doctrine disguised as simplicity. He added a new line beneath the old ones. And when the war ended, endurance was all that remained. In 1975, when Saigon fell, Torrance watched the news footage in silence. The embassy rooftops, the helicopters, the chaos. Among the burning streets, he glimpsed something surreal. A column of T-54s rolling into the city. The same model he had studied, dissected, understood. The same silhouette, now the instrument of history's punctuation. He realized then that his report had been more prophecy than analysis. Years passed. The military changed uniforms, doctrines, enemies. Torrance retired in 1980, quietly and without ceremony. He bought a small house near El Paso, spent his mornings restoring old engines, his afternoons teaching mechanics at a community college. Students liked him, calm, patient, unpretentious. None of them knew that the soft-spoken instructor had once stared down the logic of empire and found it wanting. In 1987, he received a letter on Department of the Army stationery. It was from a young researcher at the U.S. Armor Center in Fort Knox. The writer had come across his classified field report, now declassified in part, and wanted permission to quote a line in a new study about survivability design. The line was simple: a weapon that tolerates chaos will outlive the perfectionist. Torrance smiled when he read it. For a moment, the sound of rain returned to his memory, Da Nang, the hangar, the smell of diesel and earth. He wrote back a short reply. You have my permission. Just remember, chaos is permanent. Design is temporary. 2 years later, while visiting family in Ohio, Torrance made a detour to the National Museum of the U.S. Army. The hangars were vast and silent, the air conditioned and sterile. He walked past the rows of M48s, M60s, and Abrams prototypes gleaming beneath spotlights. Each one a monument to precision, each one demanding a perfect world to operate. Then, in a dim corner, he saw it. The T-54 sat behind a thin rope barrier, its green paint dulled to olive gray. The placard read, T-54 Main Battle Tank, captured near the Laotian border, 1972. No mention of the men who studied it, the jungle that birthed it, or the idea that it represented. Torrance stood in front of it for a long time. The tourists passed him by, whispering about the bigger machines, the faster ones. He ignored them. He stepped closer, hands folded behind his back, eyes tracing the weld seams he knew by heart. He could almost hear the monsoon again, the heavy breath of the engine, the creak of steel on mud. A museum guide, young and cheerful, approached. Most visitors skip this one, she said with a polite smile. Guess it's not as impressive as the Abrams, huh? Torrance returned her smile gently. Impressive isn't the same as enduring. She laughed awkwardly and moved on. He stayed there, alone, until the lights dimmed for closing. Before leaving, he rested his hand on the cold armor and whispered, "You won." That night, in his hotel room, Torrance opened his notebook for the last time. The pages trembled slightly in his hands. He wrote, "The jungle outlives the empire because it accepts imperfection. The machines that survive are the ones that expect failure and forgive it. Progress without humility is just a longer road to collapse." He signed the page MT, April 1989, and closed the book forever. When Torrance died in 1996, the Army sent a brief letter of condolence to his widow, noting his contributions to post-war technical evaluation. They never mentioned Iron Lotus by name. His notebook passed to his daughter, who kept it in a box with his medals and photographs. A decade later, a graduate student researching low-technology warfare discovered those papers in a university archive. Among the yellowed pages was the final paragraph, written in Torrance's tight, deliberate hand. History doesn't reward brilliance, it rewards resilience. The machines we call obsolete often belong to the future we refuse to imagine. The student quoted those words in her thesis on adaptive design in asymmetric warfare. Years later, those same lines would appear, unattributed, in a Pentagon presentation about autonomous systems and field survivability. No one in the room that day knew who had written them. But in a forgotten corner of a museum, under dust and dim light, a tank still sat, its steel scarred but intact, its story preserved not by historians, but by the stubborn endurance of its own existence. The placard never changed, yet the truth was written in its silence. Perfection rusts, simplicity endures, and if one listened closely enough, perhaps through the faint hum of the air conditioning and the shuffle of tourists' feet, one might still hear the whisper of an engine that refused to die, the echo of a philosophy forged in mud and rain, in a war that tried to bury it. Iron Lotus, April 1972. Endurance, not victory.